go. So they come in. Right, just admit all of them. Okay, so just we've still got quite a few people in there. So let me just make an announcement. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the Zoom session titled Book Review, Travelling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe with the author Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad and our host Dr. Yahya Burt from Leeds University. Just a reminder to everyone, housekeeping rules, please keep your phones or devices on mute. You're automatically on mute anyway, just in case if you do try and unmute them. It is being recorded. If you're not registered, please leave your email address here to receive a copy of it, and subject to CMC, we will release it. There is a Q&A session. Please write all questions down on the chat. We'll start in the next 2 or 3 minutes. I just want to make sure everyone is allowed into the room.
Abdal Hakim, when is the physical copy out?
Well, a truck driver has to make his dubious way from Istanbul to East London, and it's unpredictable how long that will take. But I would think it will be in our hands in about a week, and then however long it takes to get into the Amazon and Waterstone's systems, not sure.
Let's say June.
Slow now.
Shall I just say June then?
Yeah, middle of June, I think is the
yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I think we'll start. Let me just check. Yeah, I think we should start as we still go through. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, brothers and sisters, once again. This is the Zoom session titled Book Review, Travelling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe with Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad from Cambridge Muslim College. And we're very honoured to have it hosted by Yahya Burt from Leeds University. Right, before I hand it over to Sidi Yahya, just a kind reminder on the housekeeping rules. Please keep your phones or devices on mute. If it's not on mute already, it should be on mute, hopefully. It's being recorded. If you're not registered, or please leave your email address to receive a recorded copy, subject to CMC's permission. We'll release it. And there is a Q&A session. Please write down any questions you have on the chat, and then I'll hand that over to Yahya, who will decide whether the questions can be answers. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sidi Yahya. Bismillah ar-Rahman.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to all of our listeners. I take great pleasure in being able to host today's event. My name is Yahya Burt, and we have with us Abdal Hakim Murad, the founding dean of the Cambridge Muslim College, and the Sheikh lecturer in Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge. Abdal Hakim has brought out a new work, which we're discussing today, Travelling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe, published by the Quilliam Press. It's out digitally at the moment through Kobo and Google Play, and Abdal Hakim assures me that the physical copy should be available by mid-June. So Assalamu alaikum and welcome, Shaykh Abdal Hakim. How are you?
Alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah. Feeling a bit locked down, but otherwise physically well.
So this is a collection of 11 essays that have mostly been written in the last decade or so. Although there are 4 new chapters, unpublished chapters, as well as the introduction that are completely new. So would you mind setting out your main reason for writing the book, and who did you have in mind as your main audience? After all, you say in the introduction that it is for vagrants, dissidents, and dirties of conscience who today are unsupported by any global infrastructure or national polity.
Well, yes, that's a rather kind of romantic and perhaps indulgent way of introducing it. But I think there is a sense in which so much Muslim discourse today is being curated or regimented on various behalves, either by established Islamic organizations, structures, national governments, even by Whitehall, which has its own ways of supporting and unsupporting certain trends that are happening in the Muslim community. So I thought it would be interesting to see if one could put together a collection of perspectives which tries not to toe any of those lines and isn't really sociological either, but tries to look at the situation, the predicament, I guess, increasingly, of these new Muslim communities in Europe, trying to base oneself on the discourse or a narrative that comes from the indigenous Islamic way of looking at what it is to engage with the religious other and the fiqh boundaries about minority status. So it's an attempt to extend the traditional narrative of Islam on how to deal with minority situations and dealing with Ahl al-Kitab and others, rather than another book about what it's like to be a Muslim in France and what Islamophobia is doing in Germany, that kind of perspective, on which there are some very serviceable books. I thought it would be interesting to have a book that comes specifically from a theological perspective for a change.
Okay, and so you go on in the introduction really to sort of set out your stall really, and I kind of what I kind of took from the introduction was that finding a home in Europe will be as much a search for Europeans as it would be for Muslims of Europe. So in other words, in a way, Europe has lost itself. And that the Muslim who's true to their tradition is the one who would help them find it. But there are roadblocks in the way of that, which you go on to discuss in the book, internal and external. So externally to the Muslim community, you have a kind of new ethno-nationalism, which is becoming increasingly intolerant. And on the other hand, you talk about roadblocks within the community, maybe limitations in our thinking inherited by 20th century Islamic movements, but also kind of collapse of Muslim self-confidence, of Muslim self-esteem, which has created sorts of opposite and perverse reactions amongst Muslims, and inability to find a balanced response to this challenge, to our Islamophobic prism.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on there. I suppose one of the things I'm trying to tease out is what happens when we necessarily overcome the dichotomy of Europe being one kind of thing and Islamic discourse being one kind of thing, and kind of getting them to marry fruitfully, which is the kind of discourse one often hears, and the development of a British Islam and a French Islam, and to look at the irony and the complexity of a situation where we are being asked to integrate into cultures that themselves are in a process of, as it were, rapid disintegration, where most people, especially if they're young, no longer feel that they have deep and shaping roots in the indigenous, still less the sacred, but rather are in the grip of tides of globalization and Americanization. So the title itself, Traveling Home, is an attempt to suggest that there is a theology which allows Muslims not just to feel at home, however vaguely we might need to express that in the new European diaspora situation, but also to be actually more at home and more authentically rooted in the indigenous than most of the non-Muslims who surround us, which is a kind of perspective that seems a little bit like a debating trick. But in fact, I think if you look at Islam's historic practices of inculturation, expansion into new cultural spaces, is actually something that's quite easy to sustain. In other words, it is harder to be indigenously European in a deep sense if you're an atheist than if you're a Muslim. Even though Muslims are historically figured as Europe's paradigmatic other, along with the Jews, I suppose, and so much of European history is about self-defining as not being Turkish and not being Saracenic. At the same time, in the present day situation, it's probably the case that since 80% perhaps of what is loosely lumped together as the Abrahamic is actually shared in some sense. The monotheistic narrative, the idea of prophecy, the commandments, the big stories of the Hebrew Bible, that makes Muslims belong in modern secular Britain more substantively than modern secular people do in Britain. So I'm trying to turn the xenophobic narrative on its head and to say that the real spiritual immigrants and aliens in Europe are the secular classes rather than Muslims and other still religious minorities.
And you turn towards you try to develop a concept of Ishmaelite theology. with Ishmael being a figure who is not only true to his patrimony, but at the same time is also rejected and reviled by ISIS. Would you like to expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, I've always been puzzled by the fact that even though the kind of Abrahamic bifurcation is clearly one of the big partings of the ways in the sort of symbolic history of monotheism and is there in the Muslim narrative, it's never been picked up enormously in Muslim theology and self-reflection. What it is to be Bani Ismail, what does that mean specifically? Most evidently, it means that the one who was rejected by the dominant narrative, because the Jewish and the Christian traditions assume that Ishmael is the one who is sent out, the paradigm of the one who is ethnically impure because he's half Egyptian and doesn't belong, and Abraham seems to expel him, actually becomes a symbol of the divine intention that those who are reviled and expelled by powerful existing ethnocentric narratives are the ones who ultimately have the last laugh, which is the meaning of the founding of the Kaaba and the final prophet. So God is bringing in the eschatological age, which Muslims have always assumed that the Muhammadan age to be, bringing a new truth at the hands of the people who are most despised and most reviled. And that's what it is to be the Bani Ismail, that you are the final harbingers of the Abrahamic truth in its pure monotheistic sense. And that therefore that principle, which now no longer God-fearing Europe reviles the most, actually, in God's great irony, turns out to be the harbinger of the final healing truth that Europe really needs to be open to. So that's another example of a historic stereotype that I'm turning on its head, to turn the Ishmaelite into something about a harbinger of good news, rather than a symbol of wildness and dispossession.
In the chapter 2 is a big chapter, a big ambitious chapter on Muslims and the relation to national populism. And I had ambivalent feelings about this chapter, I have to be honest, when I read it, because you know, it's just as there was a critique within traditional Islam about riding the tiger of modernity unsuccessfully. Equally, one might ask of some adherents of traditional Islam itself, how do we ride the tiger? Can we ever ride the tiger of nationalism successfully? And I think that this chapter is a really interesting and extended way of trying to get to grips with that question. Because obviously, you go right across Europe. You look at the rise of this new ethno-nationalism in its more extreme forms, and how it's being mainstreamed in electoral politics, how an anti-Muslimism is at the center of it. And somehow it's a hybrid creature. It's not quite of the left and it's not quite of the right. At the same time, it is not anchored in any idea of rooted in Christianity, and yet it sort of harbors after, it longs for the certainty that the spiritual rootedness would give it. And you go on to suggest that, the Muslim reaction to this rather kind of puzzling hybridized phenomenon of the new populism has led to sort of, the Muslim responses, Muslims aren't really able to kind of keep up with it. So we're sort of either enclosing back into ethnicity, or we're trying to sort of double down on being everything that the non-believer would despise about Islam, being in theory, as you call it, or having a sort of inferiority complex about it, and either trying to sort of join the chorus of ethno-nationalism and Islamophobia, or just trying to keep one's heads down. So, it's quite a sort of. First of all, would you sort of paint for me the sort of how you typify this of hybrid beast of this new ethno-nationalism?
Yeah, it's new, and I think it's it's taken quite a lot of people off balance. Most people reach for standard categories of left versus right, ethno-nationalism, and that they beat their chests about a return to the 1930s and the return of fascism. I don't really think that's what we're looking at, although sometimes in the case of some of the East European nationalisms, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, it looks a little bit slightly like that. But certainly in Western Europe, which is generally our experience, it wrong-footed everyone by adopting some very key liberal beliefs. So, say the Front National in France does tend to be very pro women's rights. Gay rights is an important agenda for them. So there's a new kind of package being adopted in Holland as well, with Geert Wilders' party, which tends to be pro-gay, pro-Israel, anti-immigration, Europhobic, anti-Muslim, pro-feminist, which is a strange kind of smorgasbord of positions that seem to be plucked almost at random from different points of the traditional political spectrum, and which is making it very difficult for the traditional European liberal reflexes to deal with it properly, because it seems to be championing many of the key liberal beliefs. And I think Muslims also are a little bit perplexed and not sure what to do with this. A lot of Dutch Muslims don't really know how to cope with Wilders, who's now the most popular politician in Holland, a position which he hasn't reached by being massively anti-liberal. In fact, it's a kind of programmatic, what I call coercive liberalism. And we're not quite sure how to deal with that. So what I'm trying to do in the chapter, I guess, as well as kind of outlining what it's all about and documenting some of their positions, is to suggest that to the extent that it's just a kind of howl of protest against immigration and the loss of national purity and a crypto-racist movement, there's not really much of a conversation that we can have with it. But to the extent that it's triggered, however vaguely, by a cry of sadness over the loss of the indigenous and the traditional, that people no longer feel that they belong in their streets and in their countryside, that the world has changed. It's a protest really against globalization and Americanization. And as so often happens with these things, they fix on a convenient visible minority scapegoat, which is Muslims, sometimes gypsies, sometimes Jews, others who seem to be getting in the way of tradition because of a certain cosmopolitanism which they're supposed to represent. But with those people, if they're really suffering from the real sense of a loss of tradition, we can actually have a conversation with them. And actually, for whatever reason, sometimes people from the European populist parties do get in touch with me. I'm in regular correspondence with the head of one of the big Scandinavian so-called far-right parties, who's seriously considering becoming a Muslim, and we've had a lot of exchanges recently, and that person's concern is mainly about how family will react, but it will create a huge explosion in that country if that person does take the plunge. And that's not the only case. I recently did something on Islam for one of the very far right-wing Polish magazines, for instance, talking about Islam is precisely about the retrieval of tradition and the indigenous, and Islam is not the enemy, but Hollywood, in a sense, is what has destroyed Polish culture, not Muslim migrants. So I see that as a kind of Achilles heel, but also an indication that there are ways in which we can be, as I put it, therapists, rather than just complainants. We're not just grumbling about those people and their tiresome Islamophobia all the time and running to Whitehall to pass ever more stringent legislation to protect us from that hate speech, but instead to see why they're like that, to see the suffering that globalization, the loss of sacred identity has brought to them, and to suggest to them that actually Islam as the traditional conservative religion par excellence is an ideal place to go. And people like Knut Bernström, for instance, who was one of the most famous Swedish converts, who was the ambassador to Morocco for a while, converted precisely because he thought the Catholic Church had lost its soul following the Second Vatican Council, the loss of the old liturgy. His narrative comes from the decline of the sacred in Europe, and he ended up becoming the translator of the Quran into Swedish and a great pillar of the Muslim community. There are other people like that. And I think that Muslims really haven't done enough reading and enough empathy really to understand why those people are so upset and why they're protesting in this way. Yes, as I said, some of them are sublimated racists and just don't like people who don't look like themselves, particularly when you get down to the kind of EDL, kind of street skinhead wing of those movements. But the people who are really thinking in those movements are treating the Muslim presence as a symptom of the loss of indigenous European self, and can quite easily be dislodged from that position if anyone goes to them to explain, well, Islam isn't suicide bombing and it isn't FGM and all of those things, those headline issues. It is XYZ, respect for Jesus, a respect for family, a respect for tradition, a sacred language, a tradition of prayer and fasting. Those people can be enormously and quickly open to Islam in my experience. But Muslim communities in Europe have never really gone beyond the kind of knee-jerk, kind of reciprocal phobic reflex, which I think is putting us now into a kind of vicious circle that is going to increase polarizations on both sides, which is the last thing that Muslims or Europe need right now.
I mean, I think that you've kind of talked to some of my ambivalence about this chapter, because I genuinely think it's very difficult to get past the racism, the Islamophobia, which is very entrenched in not only at the fringes, but in, you know, increasingly the mainstream of European politics. And I think that for Muslims of color, if I can use that horrible American phrase, you know, it's understandably difficult to get past that into a dialogue, and how threatening that might seem to someone, and all the kind of microaggressions that people have to put up with on a daily basis, the hostile stares and the talking at people loudly as if the English was not their first language and so on. You know, one sees these things on the streets, even in less civil England. One sees these things being increasingly common. So while I hear you talking about mentioning about the kind of cycle of recrimination and so on, and how important it is to break it, I nonetheless see it as it's a very tall order of business for someone who is experiencing.
A tall order, but nonetheless, you can really break open some of those parties if you deal with those who are not racist, but are simply concerned with ethnic diversity as a symptom, as they see it, of the collapse of their traditional world. If you can talk about what the real reasons are for the collapse of their traditional world, then you can win them over, neutralize them, and even convert them. And last year you had the case of Joram van Glaveren, for instance, in Holland, which was a kind of Sayyidina Omar type conversion. He was the spokesman of the Freedom Party in Holland. Nobody amongst his compatriots had the least notion that he would ever actually sympathize with Islam. He was campaigning, making speeches in the Dutch parliament for the prohibition of Islam, attacks on the hijab, the closure of all of Holland's mosques, a religiously specific immigration policy. And yet he ended up becoming a Muslim and has written that book, and is a kind of symbol of pride for the Muslim communities. So to label them all simply as using Islamophobia as a kind of fig leaf for what is ultimately a kind of primitive racism, I think is not fair. And we need to push back to find those individuals who are genuinely lamenting the loss of tradition, rather than just grumbling about the color of people's faces.
Okay, well, I'm sure that's a debate that will continue to rumble on, no doubt. I wanted to move on to your chapter 5, where you talk about tanfir. And this you define as a kind of trying in a way to repel people from Islam. It's sort of opposite to dawah. Instead of attracting people to Islam, you're seeking to repel people, well, not seeking to, but unavoidably as a result of your behavior and your actions, one is becoming repellent. Could you sort of set out why you've sort of coined this term, and why you think it's important to highlight this as a current phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I'm unhappy with the kind of vocabulary that is being forced on us by mass media. So a right-wing American think tank invents the idea of the jihadi, and then after 10 years it gets into the BBC, and then Muslims themselves start to talk about jihadis. And we've internalized a structure of analyzing the Muslim predicament that is sort of profoundly inimical to the traditional way in which we categorize things, which is why I'm trying to present this book as an attempt to repristinate an indigenous Islamic way of dividing reality. But actually, it's not a term that I've coined in this case, because tanfir is in the hadith itself. The Holy Prophet says, Bashiru wa la tunaffiru, give people good news and don't repel them. And it is etymologically, linguistically, the opposite of the principle of da'wah, which is obviously the essence of prophecy itself. So as an attempt to try and describe what these radical or extreme movements might be, two terms which we can sometimes use, but I think sometimes come with a lot of baggage. I've said, well, let's drop those terms, although we can use them exceptionally, and see what happens if we reach for that thing which the Holy Prophet is warning us against, and categorize those movements as being that. In other words, people who are, in order to grab the headlines and to express their fury and panic, are doing things that seem calculated to repel people. So Daesh produced that book, Idarat al-Tawahush, where they're specifically talking about how you can use events that repel people as much as possible in order to put down adversaries and steamroller over them, whether militarily or discursively. So, yeah, I see it as the repristination of an indigenous Islamic category that's essential to the nature of prophetic religion itself. Those movements can be described as extreme if you like, but extremism is kind of relative, because one man's extremist is the other person's mainstream. And is it defined democratically or traditionally? It's not clear. It's a relativistic position. A lot of liberals seem very extreme from the perspective of a lot of traditionalists. So if we use this Sunnah term of tanfir and define and necessarily explicitly condemn those movements as being deliberately unworking the achievements of prophecy and of what the ulama have been doing over the last 1400 years by making the world hate Tawheed and hate the phrase Allahu Akbar. Apparently the phrase that most people in the world are most frightened by if you shout it at them is Allahu Akbar now. There's been a psychological study of this. It's supposed to be exactly the other way around. It was the call Allahu Akbar that overcame the tribalism and the craziness of the pagan Jahiliyyah and said, Allah is greater than all of that egotistic stuff. So we've dug ourselves into a very deep hole because of the kind of psychohistory of those movements. So I'm suggesting that instead of buying into the usual media discourse, we look at what is actually happening with these movements, which is driving people away from Tawheed. Nothing makes people jump back from religion more than stories of, well, child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, which has destroyed religion in Ireland really in a very short time. Similarly, so many Muslim countries are secularizing fast as a result of the outrageous and brutal stunts of these new movements and discursive violence as well. So yeah, I don't know if the term will catch on, but I find that it's at least caught on in my mind, and I find it a lot easier to make sense of this situation and to be judgmental about it using that term than to use something from the journalistic narrative.
And in the chapter, you also talk about, I thought, an interesting term, which was rather than regurgitating public language around citizenship and belonging, you talk about meta-citizenship.
Yep.
As an appropriate response to a sort of kind of, mutual recrimination through identity politics. So could you expand on that a bit as well? What is meta-citizenship? What does it imply for us as Muslims and so on?
Yeah, it's a fancy way of talking about something that I take to be one of the recurrent and key themes of the seerah. So the culmination of the seerah, spiritual, I suppose, was the Mi'raj, but its political culmination was really not so much the conquest of Makkah, but the Holy Prophet's forgiving of his enemies in the aftermath of that, which is exactly what Muslims don't do nowadays. We didn't let the Shah of Iran off the hook. We didn't let Gaddafi and his people off the hook. We're vengeful people, just as they were in the time of the Jahiliyyah. The Holy Prophet even forbade Hind, after she'd done what she'd done in the aftermath of Uhud to the body of his beloved uncle. He let her off as well and prayed that her love for him after she converted would increase. And that's an aspect of the seerah that's really indicatively prophetic and ethical, I think, that Muslims nowadays tend to find a little bit difficult because we're so full of frustrations and complexes and a desire for revenge and to wave our fists and to wave banners at protest and blow ourselves up in public places and to be demonstrative about our resentments. But it's a very important, as I say, culminating part of the seerah. And so I talk about the verse that says, idfa' billati hiya ahsan, push back against an offense with something that's better, looking at some of the classical, very normative tafsirs on that. And actually, Tabari in particular unlocks a whole treasure chest of amazing stories about the forgiving nature of the Sahaba, and how they wouldn't reciprocate a wrong with another wrong, but would try and do something that would break that cycle and take things to a better place, which is the essence really of Mohammedan prophethood, is overcoming the tit for tat vendetta culture of his own people, the pagan Arabs. You know, if you killed the sheep of a neighbor, his tribe would come and kill one of your sheep, and it would go on for centuries. To transcend that prophetically, to try and push back against that with something better, a doctrine that ultimately is a doctrine of not crazy forgiveness. It's not always turn the other cheek, because sometimes miscreants do need to be stopped. If somebody is slapping your brother's cheek, you can't just kind of smile and tell him to put up with it. That's not ethical either. So it's not the gospel doctrine at all of radical pacifism, but it does recognize the prophetic virtue of trying to react to a wrong with something that's a lot better than that wrong, in order to try and break that psychological, childish school playground kind of you hit me, so I'm going to hit you mentality, which is very prevalent in a lot of modern Muslim discourse.
We're sort of unconscious of the time, Midan, so just I had a couple more questions, but I'm worried that we're kind of out, our half hour is up. So just seeking guidance from you on this.
No, that's fine, as long as that's okay with the Shaykh. So
okay, well,
we can go
I think really following on from, I think your final, I'll try and combine my last two questions. So following on from your final remarks just now, in chapter 6 and 7, really sort of go on, I think, to kind of outline, to talk about how we need to interrogate anger, to make a distinction when we're being provoked through Islamophobic politics, caught between cruel Eastern regimes and Western calamity making in the Muslim heartlands, and being pressurized within Europe. How do we discern decent and demonic anger as Muslims? And how do we operationalize decent anger and avoid demonic anger as a response to these provocations?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much anger in the Muslim world, in the Muslim community, and some of it has a good grounding. If you look at what the West did to Iraq, and what it did to Libya, and what it did to Palestine, and what's happening in Myanmar and China, the outrageous things which are happening all the time. And of course, not to be angry with injustice is to minimize the grievous nature of injustice. But there's a kind of anger which takes everything personally and feels frightened, which is really from the Jahiliyyah, this Hamiyat al-Jahiliyyah, which the Qur'an speaks of, which the Prophet came specifically to overthrow. There's a difference between that and a kind of, as it were, cold, ghadab lillah, an anger for the sake of God. And the ulama, particularly in the Sufi tradition, always say that that is the hardest of all emotions. Al-ghadab lillah, to be angry for God's sake, is really difficult. And it requires a kind of really purified soul before one can experience that. Anger against treacherous, disgusting, egotistic, cruel behaviors is necessary, but it does not become a kind of personal rage that then manifests itself in across the Muslim world today, really crazy, destructive, self-destructive behavior, like the kind of zombie apocalypse that we saw in Iraq and Syria over the past few years, where such extreme forms of anger, explosive anger, resulted in Muslim societies more or less swallowing their own tail and destroying themselves and destroying their monuments and their minorities, and almost a kind of demented lashing out at anything because of this overpowering anger which those people have. But religion, by encouraging us to trust in God and having tawakkul and sabr, which are in our scripture more emphasized really than in any other scripture I'm familiar with, because we know that we're approaching the Torah Magna and things are going to get difficult. History is now very entropic. That only by maintaining our conviction of the divine omnipotence and saying la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah are we going to be able to deal with these emotions of outrage that quite naturally bubble up within many of us when they see the outrageous nature of the modern world.
Thank you for that. I mean, my final sort of short question is a broader question. It kind of connected to the book, which does this traditional Islam, which is a label which you yourself say is an imperfect, loose label in the introduction, but nonetheless, isn't there a challenge? Hasn't there been a challenge to some adherents of traditional Islam in the West that as a movement, parts of it have become too close to the Trumps of this world, too close to, you know, the cruel Eastern regimes that you mentioned in the book. And isn't it right that there is some kind of internal muhasabah or internal criticism of that movement, so that in a way the independence that you talk about later on in the book can be recovered for traditional Islam in the West?
Yeah, I mean, the traditional Islam movement now is, I think, still in its infancy, really, and really requires a very deep, intimate, reverent understanding of the kind of accumulated wisdom that you find in the libraries of the Muslim world, rather than the kind of activist literature that is that unfortunately is being foisted still on many of us in the West. But the traditional Islam movement is made up of fallible human beings, often in very difficult situations, some of whom come under quite extreme pressure. You know, if you're the mufti of somewhere in the Middle East and you know that the regime is going to imprison and rape your daughter if you don't deliver the fatwa of the general's choice, what exactly do you do in that situation? That's exactly how things are in an increasing number of Muslim societies, this kind of idea of a nationalized Islam, a kind of state church that we see in Muslim country after Muslim country, as the regimes use the repressive capacities and the kind of intrusive instincts in the kind of Assadian sense of the nation state to try and regulate everything, including religion, a temptation that Western governments are not immune to as well, as they see good Muslims and bad Muslims in Mamdani's sense, of they sort of throw some incentives indirectly, untraceably at some, and punish others, that it's really very difficult for some scholars to stay outside of that web, because increasingly it's an unfree world. It's a world that's under surveillance, and a world where, because of the radicalization panic, governments in every country without exception, I think, are trying to influence Muslim leaders and Muslim discourses. But our tradition is very clear. If anything is consensual in traditional Islam, it's that you don't visit the rulers, and you have to represent the needs and the grievances of the Muslims to the rulers rather than the other way around. And as soon as it becomes the other way around, you get into a kind of Christian Henry VIII Anglican solution, the theocratic vision, which has never been part of Islam. The ulama have always been independent of the state. The head of the state has very, very few rights to legislate or to determine aspects of right religion. It's an irony that we're always put down as being these theocrats, but actually the consensus of the ulama is always that the ulama have to be free to determine God's law, and the state just has to listen and, if necessary, tremble, but it has absolutely no role to play in the shaping of religion. And that applies, I think, as a fortiori to Muslims living in the West, that we can't really allow state actors that are not even nominally Muslim to make religious choices for us. It's none of their business. They should mind their own business rather than try and promote domesticated forms of Islam that I suspect will eventually be so far from the ijma' that they will trigger more radicalization rather than less.
Thank you very much for that very illuminating answer, Abdal Hakim. So if we can now move on to some of the questions from the audience, and several have come in.
Yes. Do you want to should we take one question from one of our Dr. Musharraf, because obviously he's an elder, respectful leader in the community. That's okay. If I can take it from directly, I'll just unmute him. Shaykh, would you like to answer, pose your question, please?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad. It's really a pleasure to see you and Yahya. And it's always refreshing spiritually and intellectually to listen to both of you. You know, mashallah, I have a great regard for both your intellectual prowess as well as the wonderful work you've done in Cambridge for the good of not just the Muslims of Cambridge, but for, I think, the whole world. You know, may Allah bless you and give you longevity. I admire your optimism about the right-wing leaders and trying to understand them more and being optimistic and hopeful. They might come closer to Islam. But I just want to ask you, what strategies would be very effective for us to win over the masses of Westerners, who I believe are very rational. They're also people who are, I think, open and also thirsty for spiritual values. what would be the strategies to win over the masses, ordinary people?
Well, that's a good question. I think that, if you listen to the conversion narrative of Joram van Glaveren, when he went to his grandfather to announce that he'd become a Muslim in this very kind of traditional Dutch Calvinistic family, and his grandfather says, "Oh, you'll have to wear pointy slippers now, won't you?" Because for the West, Islam means kind of Aladdin, the Arabian Nights, the Oriental cultures. And it's very difficult for Islam to spread and be taken seriously as a religion, rather than the kind of quaint ways of more or less tolerated ethnic minorities, to the extent that it remains very visibly culturally different. And this is very painful for a lot of Muslims to acknowledge, because they love their cultures and their cultures are beautiful. But to the extent that people are conspicuously not from the West, it's going to be very difficult to present Islam primarily as a vision about God, humanity, morals, society, rather than just as a kind of colourful ethnic particularity in certain parts of our cities. So I think it's a natural process that those more disposable aspects of our identities will fall by the wayside. And you see the new generation being more, in some vague sense, British or German or Swedish than their parents were. That's just the nature of the integration process. But it has a long way to go. So I don't think we're going to see mass sympathy with Islam as a religion and as a religious community until the kind of anti-da'wah manipulations of some people in our community who really want their mosque to be for Bangladeshis or for Kurds or for Turks or Albanians, which is an exclusivism which is closer to the Jahiliyyah than to the spirit of Islam. And I think that has to be fought, because we're already in a precarious situation in Europe. These populist movements are not going away. And we need to see what things are indispensable to our religion, which we have to hold on to, which are not negotiable, and those things which are colourful aspects of an overseas inheritance that are perhaps seen as provocative signs of Muslim defiance and difference, that I think have to be on the negotiating table, and in many cases I think have to be deliberately let go of.
Well, I've got a question here. Thank you for that. Did you have a follow-up, Dr. Musharraf, or you were satisfied? Okay.
I should add that I'm very grateful to Dr. Musharraf for inviting me to speak to his excellent congregation a few months ago, and that actually was the basis of chapter 5 in the book, which we've been talking about. So he's been the midwife to at least one of my thoughts.
Okay. Thank you. So there's a question here from Mohammed Degia. I hope I'm saying that correctly. He writes quite a trenchant question. As someone who is the target of the hate of these racists, it is difficult for me to hear a message that these folks are not actually racist, but merely hold anti-globalization sentiments. When my concern, sorry, I've lost the question, sorry. When my concern about my life and the lives of Muslims is dismissed as bellyaching, and I am sermonized about how I should reach out and explain how my deen is the conservative abode these folks should feel at home in, it sounds like plain old gaslighting of victims.
Yeah, I mean, my experience of dealing with so-called far right is different from that. They are enormously diverse. And we also need to remember that one of the most rapidly growing tendencies in the Islamophobic movements in the West is that people from those backgrounds themselves are leading the charge. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a kind of well-known example, but we've got Raheem Kassam here in the UK, the former Breitbart guy, who's now written what looks to be set to be the most best-selling anti-Muslim book in the English language. He's from a subcontinental Ismaili background, I think. So to say it's just about we're ethnically different, we're culturally different, it's racism, I don't think does justice to the complexity of the situation. That a lot of Islamophobia, even in the Muslim world, comes from Muslims themselves, politicians, journalists, novelists who are spending their lives culturally undermining Islam. So to put it down, as some do, to just a kind of polite racism, I think isn't adequate. And I think that as religious people, we also need to acknowledge that there's always a soul there and a real human being that we should be reaching out to, rather than just wildly reacting against, and that we sometimes need to put up with some of their outrageous language, as I do regularly, because I'm kind of always online with these people, and to get beyond the surface and to break through. 2 weeks ago, just before Ramadan, I was having this enormous fight with this Croat guy from Zagreb, and it was all about the Prophet's wives and Aisha being underage and jihad and blah, blah. He's now taken his shahada, and I put him in touch with Muslims in Zagreb, and it was amazing to see how that carapace melted away when I was able to deal with him, not in a kind of abusive and reactive way, but trying to see what was really going on and just presenting him with the facts. And in my experience, many Muslims are kind of incredulous that human beings might go through the kind of Sayyidina Omar moment, and the whole seerah is full of people who are outrageous and then become stalwarts of Islam. All of the Sahaba used to be pagans, really once upon a time, or Hunafat, perhaps in a small number of cases, or Jews or Christians. We've lost that, and we've become tribal now, and we just regard the thing with resentment, and we've given up hope on them, and nobody should give up hope on any human soul. And I see this as being the more authentic, Dini approach to it, rather than the kind of tribalistic, resentment-based approach that I don't think is going to benefit us or secure a good future for our community.
Yeah. Sorry, this box keeps moving up and down. Okay, a more general question here. I would love to, it's from Omid, is it Omid Safi? I don't know.
Not sure, but it's just Omid.
Okay. I would love to hear the Sheikh's thoughts on what he would see as a useful place in Sufism, in the useful or rightful place of Sufism in contemporary manifestations of traditional Islam.
Yeah, I mean, Sufism, it's a good question. Sufism is such a protean and broad thing historically that it's hard to see that there is a Sufi solution to our predicament in Europe. But there are certainly resources out there and some beautiful literatures and perspectives and spiritualizings of the outward forms of religion that I think are something that Muslims have lost. I think one of the reasons for the structural inability of Muslim communities in the West to deal with this situation and to spread the way Islam used to spread in new situations is that we've imported the infrastructure of mosques and in some countries of madrasas and Darul Ulum type institutions. But by and large, we haven't also imported the other culturally evolved Muslim infrastructure, which is that of the Sufi lodges and the zawiyas and the dargahs, which were always the centers for people to encounter people who are unlike themselves. And the dargahs in India would welcome Hindus who wanted a meal more easily than the madrasas would or the mosques would, for instance. So those liminal spaces, those overlap zones have been lost. The cultural mediators are not really here, and most of the ulama are manning bunkers of difference and not really terribly interested in really understanding the culture of the people who are around them, or developing hybrid sort of stepping stone forms of Islam that might enable mass conversions, which is how Islam came to so many hearts traditionally in India, Central Asia, the Balkans, and elsewhere. It was always the Sufis, the good ones and the bad, who were out there actually converting people. It wasn't the ulama, it wasn't the muftis, it wasn't the mosques, but we've lost that. And the kind of Pir Sahib types that we do have, say in modern Britain, instead of being cultural mediators, people interested in mission, in most cases, they are the most hidebound and the most specific in their insistence that they're going to adopt a Lager mentality, pull up the bridges and try and maintain a little bit of home in the midst of an uncomprehending England. And I think, I mean, much of the book really is a kind of discourse against the existing Sufi institutions for having betrayed their historic function of acting as mediators and platforms for da'wah. I don't think they're doing that much in the modern West, and we're all suffering as a result. All we have is the mosques and the Darul Ulums, and I suspect that's not enough. That's not the whole story of Islam.
Another question here, which is I don't think we've discussed so far in our Q&A, and I think you do touch on it in one of your final chapters addressing the state of Islamic education and the choices for students. So the question is, how do you see the future of Muslim children in British and European public schools? The tarbiyah of the children is rooted in secular atheist values. Many things like LGBT, gender issues and others are taught as early as preschool, even primary school. Muslim parents are finding it hard to cope with this hard push, especially when their children at such a young age. What advice would you give to them?
Well, most of them came for dunya and they're getting dunya, and their children are getting an overdose of dunya. And the first hadith of Islam is about migration and the intention of migration. If we've not even read the first hadith of Islam, then we're not going to understand what's going on. In British Columbia and Canada, for instance, a majority of second-generation Muslim girls marry non-Muslims. That's what migration is about. It always happens. And if you can't really deal with it, and it's very painful, well, then your religious situation is a problematic one. And just to pull up the bridges and say we're going to be an isolated community forever isn't going to work, because the young people are getting state educations. And increasingly the pedagogic ideology in the ministers of education in the West is very secular, often implicitly or explicitly anti-traditional religion. And it's going to be painful. That's what the melting pot is. If you choose to throw your babies into the melting pot, some of them will be scalded, and some of them will hurt. Some of them will come out in forms unrecognizable to you. That's part and parcel of the deal of migration. They give you a salary, you give them the souls of your children. It's always been like that. Look at what's happened to the Italians in America or many other communities. They get assimilated. But Islam is not really about the maintenance of a tribal way. Islam is about the defense of a truth. And religion all around the world is a revolving door anyway. Korea is becoming Christian. California is becoming Buddhist. Everything is in flux. Everything's liquid. And I think we need to see things not in terms of the tribe of Islam in the West, but rather the truths of Islam in the West. Many people, possibly because of the inadvertence of their parents who didn't really think enough about what would happen to their children, are moving away from the faith. But there's so many people coming in as well. So that's how I think increasingly religion is going to be in the modern world. Communication of ideas and through institutions rather than from parent to child. And it's very painful, but I think we have to get used to the fact that modernity is all about that. It gives you no guarantees about the religious identity of your children, let alone your grandchildren.
Okay, I'm just, we have got a couple of questions, but to be totally honest with you, I didn't understand them anyway. But let's go on to a more recent one. It says here, there's been this is from Shahid. There's been a rise of apostasy and in Muslims, and a growing rise of postmodernist views, which are gaining traction. What do you advise in this instance, and what future do you see for Muslim identity in the West in general?
Well, atheism is a kind of absence. Postmodernism is a kind of giving up on any kind of serious epistemological project. So intrinsically, those two are kind of cop-outs and weak. Our position is a strong one. Unfortunately, we don't study our theology, and most of the major theological texts of Islamic civilization are either badly edited or they're still in the manuscript libraries, because the reformists in Islam in the last 150 years have not been interested in theology, and they don't do the complex kalam arguments for the existence of God and the nature of knowledge and moral knowledge, simply not part of their curriculum. Even the Darul Ulums tend not to teach theology very much. They teach a lot of fiqh and fatwa, but they don't really teach theology. So as a result, we're kind of naked in the intellectual battleground. We're very poorly defended. And of course, a lot of young people not being exposed to the solid arguments the tradition has for the existence of God, because often the mosque imams have never studied that stuff, are very vulnerable, of course. They are lambs among wolves. And it's very tragic, and they suffer a lot, and their parents suffer a lot. But if the parents came without really consulting the ulama as to what they'd have to do in order to migrate Islamically, but just came because they wanted to better their lives, and if the ulama have never really learned anything about Islam's intellectual traditions, but just do hadiths and fatwa, then of course we're an extremely poorly defended community, and all religious communities are suffering at the moment. We have very good defenses, but it's quite hard to find a Darul Ulum graduate that's really well versed in kalam and traditional Islamic arguments for the existence of God, for instance. It simply is not a priority for them. And as a result, our young people are hurting.
Just to follow up on that final point, where do you see kalam jadid and new kalam rising? Are there shoots, green shoots, discernible, that places, vectors of excellence that we Muslims in the West could turn into?
I think it is starting, and it's a lot better than it was. Some of it actually comes from the Orientalists, who tend to be more interested in our intellectual heritage than Muslims themselves. We tend to despise the Western tradition of studying our culture, but very often they're the ones who really care. They're the ones who write the great books on Islamic art, for instance, and go to the art galleries and look at the masterpieces of Islamic civilization, where our people don't bother. If you go to the Victoria and Albert Museum and look at the glories of Mughal India, all created by great Muslims, it's all white folks and Chinese folks amazed by it. But the Muslims tend not to be interested. And it's the same with our intellectual legacy, and we're really not very concerned. We want to know the fatwas, and we want to toe the line in the Dar al-Ulum and not annoy our elders. It's very siloed. And actually thinking and enjoying ideas is quite unusual. However, and this is one of the things that might happen at the Cambridge Muslim College and other places where we are interested in ideas, I think there is a lot of intellectual thirst amongst young people. They do want to know what the Maturidis say and what the Asharis say about natural knowledge. And I've been very impressed by a lot of the young people. Two of our current students at CMC just got places to do master's degrees in philosophy at King's in London, for instance. Some of them will fall by the wayside, others will spread their wings, as Islam historically always prevails when given a chance. So I think probably we need another 30 or 40 years before we have a really good tradition of philosophical defense of our religion in the West. And in the meantime, we just have to try and shiver in our nakedness and hope that some of us survive.
There's a question from Dr. Said Mustafa Ali. I think he's from the Open University. His question is, what in your view is the legacy of the systemic effects of colonialism on Muslim experience, including as a factor driving migration to the West?
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that Muslim society and Muslim elites were completely shattered culturally and intellectually by the experience of colonialism. The French with their idea of the musulman évolué, the evolved Muslim who learned to speak French and read French philosophy and smoked and was part of the French world. And the British, to some extent, did the same thing in India and really messed up the minds of a lot of elite. So you get the kind of Salman Rushdie type self-hating individual who can only feel good about himself by feeling the white man patting him on the head, approving him for his hatred of his own people and his own traditions. That's enormously widespread, and Muslim elites throughout the traditional Islamic world tend to be like that. You hear a lot of Islamophobia from Turkish elites and Egyptian elites and Bangladeshi elites, and it's very tiresome. So the old elites have substantially developed this Islamophobic tradition, and they've left the working classes, the lower middle classes, the peasantry to continue with religion. And that tends to be the type of religion that comes to places like France and Sweden and so forth, not very well equipped to provide first-rate cultural and intellectual and moral leadership. So yes, the colonialists really reached deep into the hearts of Muslim societies and gave people terrible complexes about themselves. And one consequence is the kind of community leader that we see exhaustingly in British Islam, who really wants to be photographed next to the local MP and really wants to be well with the establishment and really is so happy when the bishop comes to the opening of the new Dar al-Ulum and is the guest of honor. This kind of inferiority complex. And it's fine for those people to come, but really to crave the kind of healing touch of the white man patting you on the head and validating what you're doing, when what you're doing is supposed to be lillah, something one sees again and again in these communities with their anxious leaders that are endlessly craving kind of governmental approval. And the kind of Quilliam Foundation mentality is a little bit like that. That's a kind of long-term spin-off, I would say, from the kind of mindset that the British tried to create in India and elsewhere. And it's very hard to get those people into a sense of autonomous self-respect as Muslims, rather than desperately trying to get validation from people who ultimately don't share their beliefs.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more question, because I'm very much a stickler for anything. We said an hour, let's keep it to an hour. So it says, it's from Mohammed Al-Feki, and he asks, how should, goodness me, sorry. How should Muslims understand scholarly authority in the UK? and places like the US, when people are pushing back on those leaders whose political, sorry, I'm struggling to understand this question. Okay, pushing back on those religious leaders, on the political positions of those religious leaders, how that they may choose to take, and that leads to a lack of deference towards them. So how can present communities maintain scholarly authority beyond fiqh councils or any other kind of institutional assemblage that we might come up with? Is a question about the kind of status and role of the ulama in the West. And
yeah. I mean, again,
so,
I don't think that we should beat ourselves up too much, because we're really, as a substantive presence, very new here, and we're trying to figure out what the rules of the game are. And we're under tremendous pressure, because there's, as well as racial prejudice, there's a certain amount of residual religious hostility to Muslims, there's the national populists, there's the crazy political scenario in the White House at the moment, a kind of overheated mad Zionism that regards anything to do with Islam as demonic and anti-American or anti-Western. It's very difficult for Muslim leaders really to make sense of that and to behave in a kind of balanced way with power, with the journalists and with mass media, which generally are more where power resides nowadays than with elected politicians. It's very hard, and I'm sure a lot of people are making mistakes. And I think that in the longer term, as I say, I'm very optimistic about the new generation that I see coming up. I'm quite amazed by the dedication and level-headedness of a lot of the young men and women who are training to become ulama in modern Britain. I think the discourse will be transformed in about 20 or 30 years when the leadership of the community moves into those hands, and probably the kind of convert phenomenon will perhaps die away slightly. Converts kind of make quite good mediators because they understand both worlds almost by virtue of their position. And we'll see more people of Muslim parentage being the sort of conspicuous leaders of people, of communities, especially in the United States. And as I say, I'm enormously impressed and optimistic when I meet so many of the amazing dynamic young ulama who are now being produced in not insignificant numbers in the West. But at the moment, of course, we're kind of between two worlds. The older generation doesn't really know what to do. The younger generation just look up to some celebrity converts, perhaps, and find the mosque imams a bit embarrassing at the best of times. And it's not easy, but eventually, given a chance, Islam always lands on its feet and finds its equilibrium, and that's when it really starts to thrive and starts to expand, inshallah.
okay, well, I'm really, I don't quite understand how this has happened, but just right towards the end, everybody started sending in loads of questions. So
it's always the case, yeah.
It's always, I don't quite understand why everybody was asleep. You could have sent your questions earlier, but I'm afraid your time is up, and I only leaves me to thank Shaykh Abdal Hakim for joining us today to discuss his new book, and I'm sure we'll all have a lot to gain from reading it and going through it. So, and thank you to Mizan, and thank you to all of our listeners.
Once again, thank you so much, Shaykh Abdal Hakim. Just please support Cambridge Muslim College. We've put a link there. Please try and support. There is a Ramadan campaign, and please donate as much as you can. Please purchase the book. Did you say the book is now available on Amazon? It's delayed in the...
It is an e-book for those who like to read their books on their mobile devices. Some people are doing that. Because of the corona crisis, it's hard to get physical copies into the online stores, but I'm told that so at some point in the first or second week of June, it should be popping up as a physical copy for those who like the crinkly feel of paper between their fingers. It is on its way.
Sure. And someone's offered you some, I think they've offered some black seed, best premium organic black seeds. They want to send it to you because you've been coughing quite a bit. They're a bit concerned. So maybe you should just send it to the college. Is that correct?
Coughing comes from talking and zooming too much, I'm afraid.
No problem. Okay, just a quick reminder to everyone. Tomorrow we have another session with Professor Wael Hallaq. We're reviewing his book. He's on Taha Abdul Rahman. So if you're interested in that, please register as usual and join us 6 o'clock tomorrow evening with Professor Wael Hallaq on that. On that note, we'd like to thank Sidi Yahya and Shaykh Abdal Hakim for a wonderful session as usual. May you please make dua for us during this last couple of days of Ramadan, inshallah. Thank you so much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.